and welcome to this week's Blockchain Gaming News Roundup. As ever, I'm your host, Jenny Jordan, with my co-host, John Jordan. It is Friday, the 16th of May, and today we've got quite a lot to talk about, quite big news. So let's start off with Nexon's MapleStory universe, which has gone live with its first game, MapleStory N, PC-based MMORPG. It was sort of showing really promising times with its NFT mint ahead of the launch, which got up to over 1.7 million on Avalanche. I think that's some sort of record in this year, isn't it, 2025, in terms of, you know, what people have been saying about sort of the downward market of NFTs. But yeah, so fill us in, John, all the details of the launch, and you've been playing a little bit so far.
Yeah. Before we get on, I just popped to my new hat. I got so excited I forgot to put my glasses on. So my Games TX hat. Go to Games TX at Substack, get my daily newsletter. And welcome back. Obviously, I had to sort of bumble through on my own last week. pretty awful podcast without someone to host me, just rambling onwards and onwards. It's good setup. And it's going to be a sort of we're going to talk a little bit about Avalanche actually for the first bit of the show. So blockchain we've not really spoken that much about. A blockchain that's sort of always been there and thereabouts. People have always liked it for the sort of the tech side of it, but not really. It's taken a long time for people to really get to grips with it. Certainly games to get to grips with it and feel like there's some momentum there. But now we've sort of having these sort of bigger games go live on Avalanche, partly because it does give developers a lot of sort of flexibility to create their own their own chains. It's now their own L1s. It used to be called subnets, but now they're their own L1. So that's definitely the case for Nexon. So one of the big South Korean game publishers, one of the big four, I suppose. Multi-billion-dollar company making PC and mobile games and console games as well, actually. So very successful over the last sort of 20 years. And MapleStory, that was actually its first game. So MapleStory is like 23 years ago, I think, $3 billion of revenue. A really sort of classic IP in South Korea. A 2D side-scrolling MMORPG. Where just that was, from what I can tell, that's what sort of Korean teenage boys certainly did. That was their game. They played MapleStory and lots of sort of nostalgia sort of flooding out from people who played MapleStory back in the day. Obviously there's been lots of games since and updates and mobile versions and stuff, but MapleStory N, it does actually feel in some not always good ways a little bit like a 20-year-old game. It is a PC game. It's a side-scrolling, a little bit sort of fiddly, I would say. I've only played some of the MapleStory mobile games before, but this is sort of very, I didn't know what I was doing. I did quite an embarrassing video of playing the game, and basically the first thing you're supposed to do in the game to start to start the story. I was just clicking through all these dialogue boxes really fast and didn't realise I was supposed to do this thing. So I was wandering around for ages, not thinking, what am I supposed to do? And then I had to go back to the start and sort of redo it all. So obviously that's perhaps just me, but in that way, it's probably not the people who haven't played MapleStory in the past. It's probably not the most accessible game. I don't necessarily think. I mean, mass market is a bit of a meaningless term, I suppose, but it's a 2D side-scrolling game. It's a sort of game that's going to sort of, to some degree, sort of put a lot of people off. Who obviously 20 years ago that you had a lot of 2D games. Now, obviously, I would say most games are 3D. So we'll see how it goes. But it's also part of a wider sort of push. So MapleStory N is this PC game. Which is part of MapleStory Universe, which is a much wider sort of project from Nexon, which is its blockchain sort of based ecosystem. And there's lots of moving parts to that. There's various different games. There's SDKs. There's sort of they're leveraging quite a lot into sort of user generated content and that sort of stuff. And so this is the very early sort of stages, really, of what will be like a multi-year sort of project for it to work. It seems to have got off to a good start. So the token, the let's get this right, NXPC token. So that's the underlying sort of sort of ecosystem token. They seem to have launched that fairly well, actually. So it's gone live on all the Korean exchanges. And there's been lots of giveaways. So Binance had a sort of a giveaway, and all the Korean exchanges have had sort of giveaways as well. And various other people, are going to all the details. It's not really been sort of an airdrop for gamers, particularly, but there's been sort of a lot of money pumped into the ecosystem. So people are at the moment buying and holding. It looks like so the price is up from sort of when it was first tracked. I guess with all these things, we'll see how long that lasts, because as soon as a token starts going down, then people have got it for free. They hold it if it's going up, and as soon as it starts going down, they sort of obviously sell it because it's free money, and they're not. Those people are not necessarily playing the game, and that's always been sort of the big problem with crypto held on exchanges. Those tokens never go into the game, so there's sort of like two separate economies going on there. So sort of early days for that. And the other thing is, it is. I don't really understand this, and it's not terribly clear to me which geographies they are not allowing the game to even be installed in. So obviously there's the usual sort of, Iran, North Korea, Syria, countries that, Cuba, not allowed because of US sanctions. It also seems to say that the US is not allowed. You're not allowed to play it in the US. Not allowed to play it in South Korea. Again, that's sort of expected because South Korea has very strong crypto laws, and it's not allowed, despite South Korea being a very crypto sort of interested sort of culture. South Korean games are not allowed to be played. Blockchain games are not allowed to be played by South Koreans. So obviously, they all use VPNs, so that's the way around it. It's a bit weird for the US. Obviously, US regulations have, are very much fluid, but in the positive sense. So the president's releasing meme coins. So it's not like a game's going to get sued in the US for releasing a token. I wouldn't think. So that's sort of quite odd. And it also seems, obviously, we're in the UK, and to even download, to download it and play it, I had to use a VPN. So that's a little bit odd. The UK does actually have some odd rules around crypto, which but some like obviously the US and the UK, and it seems like some of the European countries as well weren't being allowed. So I'm not 100% positive about what countries are and what aren't. I'm certainly not sure why that would be the case, but obviously that would limit the sort of audience. But maybe because this game has been really popular in Southeast Asia, at the beginning they're just sort of focusing on that region. They did have some sort of problems at the launch, but problems for there being too much demand, so they had to take it down for maintenance for a couple of hours because some things weren't working. In terms of the blockchain, I've not really got to that stage yet. Basically, there's a certain stage where you can mint out your character as an NFT. So at the moment, when you start playing off, it's just a Web 2 game. Although you do have to connect a wallet to the web page in order to download the game. So there is that sort of there is it's sort of in that sense sort of crypto gated. You can't just roll up and do it. And interestingly, the only option was MetaMask, so you had to connect a MetaMask wallet. So that's sort of a lot of games now would have the ability to create a sort of wallet for you using email. So there's lots of sort of Privy and Web3 Oath and people like that. Sort of obviously Immutable have their sort of thing as well. So that's a pretty standard technology. They're not used that as well. So that may limit the sort of number of people playing it in the sort of short term. We'll have to sort of see how that plays off. Also, as you say, a lot of demand. So 1.7 million people minted out this free NFT. I mean, it's a pretty meaningless NFT, I think. It won't be worth any money, but obviously it was free, so loads of bots in there. But that shows some level of demand. And if you look at the Avalanche C chain, which is their main sort of chain, the sort of I can't remember exact figures, but it's sort of like 10x over the days in which this NFT was being minted. So you just sort of see, there's not a lot going on with Avalanche, I think, at the moment in general on the C chain. But you can see these sort of games coming in can have quite a big impact. So yeah, it's a bit, so far so good, but obviously a long way to go.
So it did report, I think, hitting over 6 million wallets and over 3 million monthly active users due to the mint itself. So not insignificant, you would say. And talking of Avalanche, actually, and that sort of momentum, as you mentioned before, we've not really spoken a lot about it. It's been off the grid in the past, launching on Avalanche, and then there's been the kind of other anticipated shooter, Shrapnel. What was going on with that, I'm not quite sure. but other than that, MapleStory Universe has been the sort of big thing, and now also revealed this week was the news from Finnish developer Empires Not Vampires that they are bringing their Paradise Tycoon game and other games within their ecosystem. They've also, what's it called, Paradise Legends, a mobile game they've announced. That is all also going to move to Avalanche with its own Paradise chain. I don't know if that's built on the C chain or if that's going to be its own L1.
Well, I think they, as far as I understand it, the C chain is sort of the Avalanche's sort of L1 in the sense that Ethereum just has an L1 sort of thing. So everyone's creating their own L1s using the Avalanche sort of SDK, and they all link back to the sort of the C chain because that's sort of the main Avalanche sort of thing. So as I say, when MapleStory was minting these NFTs, it was minting them on the C chain, but the game itself is running on this its own L1. So you want most of the activity. If you want your own sort of L1, you can just run a game on the C chain. So as we'll sort of, but I'll mention it now. So Pixelmon has also announced this week that it's gonna. I don't think they. I'm not sure if they ever said what blockchain they were on. Obviously, they got their main NFT mint back in the day was on Ethereum, but they've said they're launching
games on Base as well. I think. Previous games they've launched.
Yeah, but so it looks like they're sort of you can use Avalanche as their sort of main chain now, and they said they got this Warden's Ascent mobile game that's coming out, and they say that's going to run on the C chain, so they're not going to run their own infrastructure for that one. They're just going to run it on the C chain. But then they have the various other games in development, and they seem to be, they say if we feel like we need that extra capacity and we want to, because the thing about running your own chain is you can set your own validator set. You can sort of choose, I guess to some degree you can choose how big your blocks are, how fast they work. So depending on how you want to set that up, you have more flexibility. So you can run stuff on the main C chain. But if you feel like you have having a lot of transactions, or you want to sort of tune the way the blockchain works, you basically create your own chain, which is obviously what Off the Grid have done. And say, I mean, the Paradise Tycoon is a sort of an interesting one because that's a sort of more of an indie game. As much as you can have indie blockchain games, I mean, it doesn't seem to be like a very high sort of throughput, a gaming needing a lot of sort of high throughput. But they're doing their own Paradise chain. So just
surprised actually to see they were still going. I was quite happy, but I mean, I think in the past they've announced sort of funding rounds in the size of sort of $1 million. So it's not like a 48 million or 200 million kind of game.
No, they're very. I mean, they say they a fairly small indie team out of sort of Finland came out of mobile games. I've sort of met up with them over the years, and they've. Yeah, it's interesting. As you say, they're at a scale where you wouldn't be surprised if they just said we run out of money and we can't really, economic reasons we can't really do this. But they've just sort of kept going. I don't know how they managed to do it, but they seem really committed. And it's good that they've been running this Paradise Tycoon game for many years in various forms. And now, as you say, they've got this other game, Tycoon Legends. You say this sort of more action-based game that they actually did a sort of a prototype of it in the Paradise Tycoon game, which is more of an Animal Crossing type game. So and all this. So I guess this is all to some degree been orchestrated. All this Avalanche announcements have been sort of announced this week because next week is Avalanche's summit. So this year it's in London. So I'll be going down next week to see what's going on there. So it's a 3-day summit, and gaming is not, I say, not a growing part, but not still an enormous part of Avalanche at the moment. But they have, as you sort of expect, the usual suspects, so Off the Grid and MapleStory and a few other some panels about AI and stuff as well. But most of the stuff is not gaming, but obviously on the gaming side, sort of Avalanche goes into that conference with sort of creating the headlines. So
good. Right, so it's a few weeks ago now, isn't it, when the Apple ruling, Epic versus Apple ruling came out. We didn't discuss it really in detail because there was some other big news that week to discuss. We did sort of say, will this have an impact on Web3 gaming? Yes, of course it will, but what sort of to what level? And we sort of just discussed it between us a bit, and we've got a Mavens feature coming up on the subject next week as well, with a lot of great sort of experts sort of sharing their more realistic views. Some think this is going to change quite a lot, whereas others are more, well, you know, Web3 gaming clearly has bigger problems than kind of Apple fees. So anyway, so one game that's already actually jumped on board this new regulation is Animoca Brands creating the Fence Hero Tower Defense game with this tower token that's been in existence for, it feels like an age now. I don't know when that launched actually. So they now have links in game that leads out to their web store where you can use the tower token for in-app purchases. So good to see someone's jumped by. I haven't seen any other Web3 game sort of announce, at least, that they've gone on board. But I guess developers might hold off sort of a bit, because obviously Apple has, what's the word? They have
appealed.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, like, as you say, so it is a interesting one in terms of how significant it is, and I guess to a degree, how significant it is depends a little bit on, you know, whether you have a game in the App Store and how much money you're sort of paying Apple on the 30%. So, just to sort of recap, Epic have been suing Apple over many things to do with sort of monopolistic practices, and actually Epic lost most of that case. But one of the things it did win was that Apple and Google were forced to allow people. So if you have an app, you can basically tell your audience, if you click on this button, it's going to take you out of the app to a web site, a mobile website, where you can buy the things you're buying in the app cheaper. Because obviously you're not paying Apple and Google charge you 30% for in-app purchases. So in general, mobile gaming, these web stores have been massive for a couple of years now. So people like Supercell and Playtika and stuff have been, because they have such big billions of dollars of revenue, and they're giving 30% of that away to Apple and Google. For them, getting that outside and reducing that sort of margin is pretty significant. But obviously, it's because they have very large sort of revenue, which most games don't have. And so the weird thing was that Apple were told they had to allow this, but they did allow it, but in a very parsimonious way. And they charged 30% for in-app purchases, and they set, for some bizarre reason, they set the rate they take if you link out to 27%. So, a 3% difference, not really very much. And the judge's ruling is this is ridiculous, and they got internal, discussion from Apple, who basically just made up 27%. There's no sort of logic behind it. So the judge is very angry with them, and say Apple are appealing, but it seems hard that the judge will sort of back down now. So and then on the back of this, Epic also, which has this Epic Game Store for PC games that we've spoken about, also has a sort of version of that for mobile. Not much in it at the moment, mainly just sort of Epic's own games like Fortnite and Rocket League and stuff. But they're trying to push that as well. So it now seems like you can now link out from Apple and at the moment, I don't think Apple's charging anything if you link out and then you buy that in-app purchase through the web store, not using the Apple Pay sort of rails. And then Epic have also said if you put a game into their Epic Game Store and you can make $1 million without being charged anything, and then it's 12%. But for most people, you're not going to. But it's very hard to generate revenue through the Apple Game Store. It's just that's not, people aren't used to that in the same way. So let's probably set that one aside a little bit. But the issue for people like, I guess, Mythical Games would be the obvious one, who have been successfully operating in the App Store with blockchain games, is they've sort of, because of the previous sort of rules, they've built entire new, basically, in-app purchase currency systems in order to pay Apple its 30%. So they've sort of built, they've worked around the regulations as they were with this new sort of system. So the fact the regulations have gone, I mean, obviously they can just link out now, but they've sort of set themselves up where they're sort of they're sort of in a weird way sort of breaking their own sort of system that they've set up. So it's actually in the long term, clearly, if we assume this 30% goes away, if you link out, then everyone's going to be linking out. But it's sort of hard to judge in the very short term how easy that will be, and it will sort of change a lot of the UX on some of these NFL rivals being the sort of obvious game. And Mythical have this FIFA rivals coming out fairly soon, so I don't know how quickly. Obviously, you'd want to go live with the linking out because that's going to be a pretty big game, and you think going to be fairly significant amounts of revenue generated with that, you'd hope. So that maybe the guys in Colombia, the developers in Colombia, maybe working overtime to sort of fit that new framework in. But I think it's harder to retrospectively fit it in. But as you say, Crazy Defense Heroes is sort of the first to do it. I should point out it is only for people on iOS in the US that they have this option for. And as I say, I mean, that game is, it was originally a Web 2 game that they sort of were bringing Web 3 into. I wouldn't say that has been tremendously successful because originally they had these various tower defense games that were Web 2 games that had millions of players, and they were going to sort of bring Web 3 into that over time. And they did this tower token, as you say, and I think that they were going to then release, and did actually release, a web game, a browser game that was Web 3 sort of enabled from the ground up. So they were sort of going to take these audiences and bring them into this new Web 3 game. It seems like that that sort of project has stalled, or I don't know if it's been cancelled. Nothing official that I've seen, but it's definitely I can't see it anymore. The game is live, and it seems like they're using these projects as sort of quite experimental. So in a sense, they're doing this to see if it works. They don't really. They're not making so much. It's not for them getting this extra 30% or making money on it. It's just, can we do this from a technical point of view? Yeah. I really don't think anyone who's playing Crazy Defense Heroes, or very few, will be going, oh, right, I can save 30% more in-app purchases, so now I'm going to go and buy this tower token and do all the wallet stuff. And obviously people who are, there'll be maybe a few hundreds of people who already have the tower token, and for them it's sort of, I'm getting this extra sort of stuff for free, whatever. But it's not, it's not won't be significant in the way it might be for us of a Mythical game. So, but I mean, good to see it happening. And I think in a year's time, it will be significant for companies who are generating millions of dollars through in-app purchases. But in Web3, that's not where we are at the moment. So.
No. I think with Animoca, it's often they just want to be the pioneers and go in there and show things are possible that haven't previously been possible, and they often do, like we've discussed in the past, of what other developers aren't doing. Where there's a gap in the market, they want to go in and fill that gap, and so very much in that sort of spirit, they are the first ones to announce.
Yeah, and it's good headlines for them, and obviously they have a whole bunch of companies making games. So to that degree, if it's like a technology sort of demonstrator or a financial demonstrator, this is how we did it, and then other people can sort of use those sort of that tooling if it's appropriate to them. So and I think also they also want to push forward generally to the industry, not just to their own sort of games. They want to sort of show this can be done, and obviously we're talking about it, so to that degree it's worked.
Yeah. Good. And talking of Animoca brands, let's continue. The executive chairman and co-founder Yatsu were in the news in the Financial Times, in fact, and announcing that Animoca is looking to IPO in the US. So you can tell us a bit more about that, please, John.
Yeah. I mean, sort of makes absolute sort of sense. So, I mean, Animoca they're based in Hong Kong, but they have sort of financially always been headquartered in Australia. And they were a very tiny company, but they before they sort of switched to blockchain, they were on the Australian ASX exchange. So they were, they were a very small cap company. I think their market cap back then was about 10 million or something like that. So they were, a pretty small sort of mobile games company on this stock exchange, and then they started getting into blockchain. Partly, I guess, that was back in sort of 2020, 2021 sort of era, and obviously a bit more sort of cowboy-like sort of behavior. And I think people weren't quite sure about crypto, and I don't think Animoca did anything wrong. I did remember speaking to them at the time about it. But basically, that exchange didn't like some of the things they were doing, particularly around, it seems to be the Sandbox Sand token launch. They sort of, I guess their accounting standards probably around crypto weren't sort of so sort of determined as they are now. And I think the feeling was also that some exchanges even back then were sort of more or less pro crypto, and that exchange was not pro crypto, so actually anti crypto. So they basically got kicked off that exchange, and obviously exchanges can kick companies off for various different reasons. And I think reading between the lines, they just kind of felt we don't want this. A pretty small company, and there's this sort of this crypto thing going on, and also because they were such a small company, then they were sort of riding this crypto wave. I think their share price started going up a lot. So I think the exchange was sort of almost a bit worried that this company is just growing so much and we don't really understand sort of what the business model is, and how do you account for they've just created 1 billion tokens and only some of them are circulating, and they're worth this, but obviously the rest of the 1 billion aren't worth that because they can't sell them. And so you can understand it from both sides. It was sort of a complicated situation. So anyway, they got kicked off the exchange. And so they've been in this sort of weird situation where they have been a public company. So people, maybe sort of Australian pensioners sort of owned Animoca shares or something. There was a story at the time, actually, some 18-year-old boy really liked it and was really into blockchain. So he basically somehow got a list of people who owned the shares in Australia and like phoned them all up and sort of went around and sort of got their share certificates or something. He actually became quite wealthy off the back of that. It's obviously a smart thinking chap. So there's obviously Animoca as a brand has really succeeded in crypto. There's always been talk about, there's a couple of years ago they were talking about would they list in Europe, and there was some sort of, I think obviously they would always be looking at that. So they've raised tons of money. You can raise money because people think you're growing and you're going to be a very valuable company. But at some point, investors or whatever level, if they're sort of VCs or just institutional or just pension holders, like to see a company sort of floating on the stock exchange. So that gives them a chance then to sell their shares out, or some of their shares, and regain some of that sort of cash. So I think internally and from investors, there would always be a push for Animoca. Always, at the start of the year, can we IPO anywhere? Because they are, I think, is it like, I can't remember the numbers, like $4.5 billion. Their audited accounts are now their value in terms of sort of all the tokens and investments. Got 450 investments, so equity investments into companies. Most of those probably won't go anywhere, but some of them may be enormous. Obviously, they own things like the Sandbox. And their revenues for a blockchain company, $300 million. They're profitable. So even if you strip out all these weird blockchain assets that they hold, they would be a company who would be valued in the billions of dollars just on their sort of revenues. And also they have another $2 billion worth of like sand tokens and all these other sort of weird tokens of which they own the companies. So they own this. Not 100% of the Sandbox, but they own a whole bunch of sand tokens. Those are sort of illiquid. You can't really sell them. So it all gets a bit complicated. But anyway, but by any stretch of the imagination, Animoca is a company worth a number of billions of dollars, and obviously that's in crypto terms. But it would also be worth some measure of billions, maybe less, in just sort of like fiat IPO terms. Like Coinbase owns a lot of crypto, but also is a company where you can buy the shares. So clearly the US is the place where if you were launching any company you want to launch at the moment, that's where the deepest markets are. That's where the most money is. Their exchanges obviously have crypto companies in there already. The current administration is obviously the most crypto friendly you can have. All the laws have been stripped out. So I think I was quite surprised that was sort of talking to the FT about this, where he's sort of like he sort of said we'd be stupid if we didn't try. So quite I imagine he would only do this if they were pretty nailed down that they were going to start doing this. Otherwise, why would you talk to the FT if you were going to suddenly have to cancel it? So I imagine they pretty much know we've got option A and option B and maybe option C, but one of those we're going to be doing it. Because I mean, the other thing, like we've always sort of said with Animoca, quite how you value these things, hard to tell. But you cannot, if you had a share of Animoca, you have a share of a stake in 150 crypto companies, a lot of games companies, but a lot of they've done lots of about education recently. That's one of the sort of big things they launched, and they've got the whole Mocha thing, which is another sort of token they've launched, and a whole bunch of stuff is really weird, but some of it you could imagine actually in 10 years' time being sort of quite fundamental. So I think they would be attractive to institutions, and they would also be attractive to retail investors who just buy $100 of this, and maybe it'll turn into $1,000. Not investment advice, by the way. So I would expect fairly soon that they'll get on that bandwagon, and there's lots of other. Like Kraken, the big exchange, is looking to IPO. There's a whole bunch of crypto people who are companies that are fairly big scale, and their business happens to be crypto. So they would be good people. You just got to think there's just going to be sort of a wave of crypto companies who've been waiting for the last 5 years to IPO.
Good. Good. So Pixels has announced it's actually launched its AI agent, AI Veronica, inside the game. So users can go to this special house castle in the game, and you can interact with AI Veronica, and it's a bit similar actually. It made me think of Blocklords, Eliza Rivard, that was launched earlier in the year, or was it last year? Anyway, so you're trying to sort of persuade these AIs to like you. It's sort of bachelorette, so it's 6 different AI agents, I think.
I think it's actually more than 6. I actually did it. I actually tried yesterday, and me being me was totally incompetent. So yeah, I think there's I can't remember if it's 6 or 8 or something. But anyway, you go into this little castle, and they each have a little door, and you sort of have to buy a key, which is 100 pixels, which is currently $5, and you can only go in once a day. So you go into. You choose which door, you go into there, and me being sort of quite new to Pixels, I didn't realise how the thing works. So I just wandered around and thought, how does this work? And I didn't know how it worked. But you can give them gifts. So I gave them a bunch of gifts, but then I didn't talk to them what the one I went to see. And then I had to search up what I was supposed to be doing. And you're supposed to use the in-game chat, which I didn't know. So that more for me. I'll try again today. So it's quite nice. I mean, I'm shooting.
You're going to see sort of in real life there who is the proper charmers, who are a bit awkward.
Yeah. So anyway, so we'll sort of it's sort of, I don't think it's not a massive sort of feature, but it's sort of quite a nice thing. And I think the thing with Pixels at the moment is they're going through these sort of changes, and they want to obviously get more sort of use of the Pixel token, and just particularly for their very high end players who've been playing for a long time. Those sort of games you sort of end up finding it hard to do new things. So these sort of events, seasonal events, just give you people who've got whatever tons of pixels knocking around. It sort of makes sense. So I thought it was quite a nice sort of implementation. And even for the newbie players like me, probably most of them wouldn't have 100 pixels knocking around, but it's just sort of you're going to feel like you're in this world, and there's these different things to do. So there's that, and they got the Pixel Dungeons thing as well. That's sort of in the game now. You can go and play that, and so you kind of feel like there's the whole Pixel sort of the universe is sort of building out a little bit around that. So.
Yeah. The CEO, Luke Bowakowski, is really transparent on Twitter with how things are going. He seems very positive that they're doing things right, and that they are sort of really getting close to finding a right balance. I've seen millions of pixel staked back into the ecosystem that they are spending, sort of finding that those right users to reward that are actually contributing back to the ecosystem. So yeah, good. And talking of Blocklords, actually, MetaKing Studios, Swedish studio, have launched the battle mode after I think about 1.5 years in sort of open beta, where farming has been sort of only. I mean, this is like a grand medieval strategy game, probably the most ambitious in Web3. I tend to see it that way anyway. So they are really taking their time. They are really
Yeah,
sort of ambitious with what they're doing. So they're not kind of quickly and simply just throwing different features and modes out there. So they've had this farming mode live for quite some time, and only now they've announced or launched battle mode. It's called Battleborne,
yeah.
and yeah, they've got some other kind of significant features as well, launching later this season with where you can sort of upgrade your heroes and stuff. But talk us through a little bit, John, what that means for the game and
Yeah.
maybe overall for the sort of Blocklords ecosystem.
Yeah, as you say, the sort of game's been in sort of what they call early access for. I mean, is getting on. It's over a year and a half now. And that was just the farming aspect of it, which did get pretty boring. It was grindy. I mean, farming is that's what we call it, farming. But it had got a bit stale. They occasionally do these season passes or battle passes, so they're quite good for grinding because you're earning sort of the resources and that sort of stuff. So they don't maybe 3 of those, I think, and they've got another one coming with this Battleborne thing. But Battleborne is sort of I mean, you could call it the battle mode, but it's basically, if you think of the farming as like the base of the pyramid, pretty dull. No one gets excited about. Obviously, people do farming games, but in this case, you're just getting these resources and leveling up your buildings, and it gets progressively harder and get a little bit frustrated. And the other thing all the time is they're looking at the economy. So if you've got, how many meat is worth gold. Gold's are sort of the obviously the money that you use to buy. If you've got a lot of milk, you sell your milk and you buy wood, you need to upgrade your building. So that's sort of fine, and they've been sort of working on that. But the battle mode is entirely different. You have, you basically you have a sort of a troops, so you have a commander, and you have up to 6 sort of troops in their battalion or whatever. You can have 3 battalions in a squad, and I think you have up to 3 squads. I mean, obviously I'm not there yet. And sort of, in a sense, it's not a sort of fully fledged battle simulator with something like Total War, which is all about that. So this is somewhat slimmed down. So yeah, at the moment you have cavalry, archers, and normal soldiers. That's the typical, sort of rock paper scissors thing you have in these battles. So you're sort of setting them up and you're moving them around. So it is real time. And you're sort of fighting different. You go to like a different map and you're sort of fighting these different sort of troops and stuff like that. But it sort of feeds into the farming bit because you need like rations and iron to sort of maintain your armies in the field. So suddenly now the farming thing has use, because if you don't do the farming stuff or can't buy those resources, then you can't your troops are sort of tired and hungry and they won't fight, or fight really badly and you lose. So you start to get the sort of the combination of, here's the base of the sort of slightly boring bit we've been doing for the last year and a half, and now here comes like a more exciting thing. But then that also forces the boring bit to become not more important, but it adds different sort of reasons for doing that, and you have to spend time on the boring stuff in order to get to the, sort of the more fun stuff. Put it that way. And then there's this, as you say, there's going to be a battle pass coming, and then there's these more sort of leveling up your commanders, and there's going to be like an XP resource that you need that. So, and obviously you want to at the moment with your troops, you do level them up, but they're sort of like disposable, so you're not really attached to them. But commanders at the moment are sort of the NFTs they made out of the Blocklords Dynasty game that came out last year. And then the commanders are going to be a sort of step above that, so they're going to be sort of more important. But there's still the overall thing, as David Johansson told me, that basically all your characters in the game are going to die, because that's so it's pretty hardcore. And I think permadeath in blockchain games is going to become more and more important, because otherwise you just get more and more sort of characters and more and more NFTs, and inflation sort of blows the whole thing up. So you need to have these sinks where things are destroyed, and obviously that creates a sort of tension, risk reward sort of thing. So I think the problem with that game is that they are trying to, as you said, it is really ambitious, and I think unless you're playing that game a lot, you don't realize how ambitious what they're trying to do is, because it's not, it's a game, a blockchain game, in a sense, sort of fully on chain, when it will be on their Lords sort of chain. But the whole economy is the important bit, and they have to run that economy long to work out how people are trying to exploit it. And actually, one of the interesting things, if you've been playing the game a lot, when the Battleborne thing has come in, you realise that you used to be able to get. I'm making these numbers up now. You used to get like 5,000 wood was worth 50 gold, but now 5,000 wood is worth like 10 gold. They've really sort of capped it down, so it's again inflationary. But so you have this sort of complicated economy where people are buying and selling all these different resources. There's about, I don't know, probably a dozen different resources now. You need them all for different things, and people have more of one than the other depending on how you set up your farms and all this sort of stuff. So it is, you can see there are a lot of moving parts, which is why they have been slow. I guess the problem is going too slow means you sort of lose your momentum, and can you get that back again? Probably adding a big battle thing into a game does, but I guess if you're starting the game now and you don't, to building up the farm takes quite a long time. So my farm's not, I wouldn't say super advanced, but I have been playing that game off and on for a year and a half, so I've got to a certain kind of level. The other thing they have added in is sort of a better shop system. So there's various in-game assets that you can use to sort of get some of those things that you can get on the farm slowly over time, or you can just go and buy 50,000 wood, whatever, in a package. So they've sort of made that more complex, and also now for the first time they have the ability to spend with your debit card to go and just buy things directly. And actually they have this thing called influence, which you can get if you stake their token called Lords. So if you stake the Lords token, you get a certain amount of influence every day, so that builds up over time. But you can just now go in with money and buy influence. So they are sort of, again, not in the in-game economy, but the sort of like the financial economy now with the blockchain bits is now being brought in. Again, they're going to have to fiddle around with that, I'm sure, because people will, at the moment, buying the in-game influence is super expensive, but it is there, so they're going to have to do all that But they are trying to build a thing where you would have build dynasties where you'd have these NFT sort of characters, lords and ladies, having children. I mean, that's a whole other thing. They've spoken about that, but how that happens, I mean, obviously just minting an NFT, but how you actually how you actually age these characters and kill them off. I mean, they must have an idea for it, I hope, because they've been working on it for 5 years. But that's complicated, and when that happens, that will be quite a big thing, I think, because then you are really having a whole economic and social sort of cycle going on there in the game, and that's the sort of reason I'm playing, because not because I think at the moment every time I play that game, it's so exciting. Sometimes it is, but often it's a grind. But to get to that stage, I think that's it is one of the games that is, I think, most ambitious in terms of you wouldn't know you're playing a blockchain game if you're playing it. And it is very close to how you would expect a normal Web 2 game doing that sort of thing. Obviously, you could make Blocklords without the blockchain. It would be really simple, because you'd have control of everything. But the thing that makes it significant is all this stuff is assets on the blockchain, and you sort of have this permadeath and minting, and obviously, I won't go into all of it, but it is quite more significantly interesting when you start to understand how all these things will play out.
Yeah, sure. You're much more patient than I am. I did actually play it for a couple of months, but I just had my farm sort of getting attacked all the time. Then I gave up. But maybe this is my sort of moment. I should get back into it and try it out.
But that sort of was the. I mean, that's sort of the problem when you're playing a game, sort of an open access game like that, or an early access game. Is exactly the same time. Your farms are getting destroyed all the time. You just getting raided all the time. They obviously, they did dial it back down again. I'm sure people complained, but you would just lose players through that. But they feel like we have to go through this cycle of trying. We have to make this game hard, and it is at that level it is sort of more an art rather than a science of knowing you can go through a cycle where you're going to make loads of horrible mistakes and lose half your players, but you have to go through that cycle to make the game. You can't not make that decision. you have to make that decision even if you know you're going to be wrong. So
yeah,
yeah,
good. And obviously, another ambitious game to finish
yeah,
off this podcast is going to be Wildcard. Well, already ambitious, and even more so
yeah,
because done by Paul Bettner and his Playful Studios.
yeah,
You spoke to him and the game designer Brad Ware. Is
Brad,
that how you say
yeah.
it? And so they are anything but throwing things out there quickly. This has been a work in
Yeah,
development for 7 years, I think.
yeah.
Tell us a bit about the process of making Wildcard and also how this Web3
Mm.
streaming platform Thousands came about.
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, or picking up some of the threads that we talked about with Blocklords. So Wildcard is a Web 2 game. So there is a sort of a misconception, or a misconception has grown up around it because they raised a ton of money, like $46 million, basically from a blockchain crypto investor. So, but the game has never was planned to have sort of NFTs or tokens in there or anything like that. And the struggle they've had is just making it the game they want it to be. So it's a sort of a mashup of sort of MOBAs and character collection and action games. It's like sort of like has a sports sort of feel to it. And they obviously, they've worked on really big games, really successful games. So they have a very strong idea of when a game is finished. So they said really, Age of Empires was this sort of big strategy, sort of action strategy game from Microsoft, and they said that when you get to the sort of what you think is the game could be finished, and some people think it is finished. If the developers, having worked on the game all day, aren't going home and playing the game in their off time, then your game, the game's not finished, because if they're going home and playing someone else's game, then your game is how can you expect other people to play the game? So in a sense that they've raised a ton of money, they're very experienced, and they've made games that have done billions of dollars. So they have a particular vision of what they want the game to be, and they've had the money to be able to do that. So not many teams have had those sort of drivers. And the game still might not work, but a little bit like we were saying with Blocklords. The designer Brad said basically, I come in and sort of question everything. So why is this like this? And sometimes we question it and we go through a whole process of ripping it out and trying to put something else in, and we come back, and a year later we sort of back to where we started. But we've made the game better in some ways by that process. So they've been very lucky in the sense that they've been clever as well, because they're a very small team. So there's like 30 full-time people, but a lot of them have worked together for like decades. So they're a very efficient team. They use a lot of outsourcing for their sort of art and everything like that. The game is a beautiful-looking game. Characters are obviously very important for a character collection game. Top of the range sort of character collection stuff. But they are still fiddling around. I won't go into all sorts of details, but they had this sort of previously on the MOBA thing. They had this sort of these spheres you had to blow up. And then about a year ago, they took that out and made goalkeepers instead. So they have these big, enormous sort of behemoth characters that you have to destroy, but they're sort of, almost like sort of Titan type characters, much more exciting. And then the other big change was it used to be a 1v1 game. So, I would play you, and then everyone would always asking, can you make it 2v2? Because that obviously is more social and it's sort of higher skill. If, you have to get two players who are complementary, and it makes it interesting in terms of what character I'm using. Obviously, all the different characters have different sort of attributes, and some work better against others, and all that sort of stuff. So but obviously, if you're doubling the amount of stuff happening on the screen, so that's just complicated from just a rendering and physics and all that stuff point of view. So it's complicated. But they've moved it to 2v2, so it's a 2v2 game. So on the game side, it just goes to show now, how how focused people can be on doing something new, and this sort of mashup of genres. It may not work, but it's always been a Web 2 game, and there's been no blockchain in there. And I think that's been hard enough for them to do. So you sort of see with Blocklords where they're basically making their game is totally Web 3. So they're trying to do this. I mean, they haven't got the same funding at that level, and they're not that experienced as the Playful guys, but you can see how complicated it is because they're trying to do something with the blockchain in it. And Playful have found it hard enough to make a game the game they want to make without any blockchain in there. So, but the funny thing was, they originally. The reason the game is designed for streaming, so it's designed for people to watch it, and lots of people have tried to do that over the years. It's proved to be pretty difficult. But Paul said the starting point is, if I was going to make a game that I knew people were going to stream, how would that impact my game design choices? So they focused on making the game, and they thought on the streaming side we'll just use Twitch, because that's obviously Twitch is the massive platform owned by Amazon, and that's how everyone streams games pretty much, certainly in the West. But then they started to try to use Twitch and talk to the team at Amazon, and can you add these things in, these hooks for cameras and stuff, and can we start to use plugins? And they went through all that process, and they weren't happy with it. So at some point they said, well, can we just do our own? So they didn't plan to do that. That wasn't part of the initial design sort of doc or funding. But when they did do that, they realised that could be where the Web3 sits, and that's what the case is now. So there's a thing called Thousands, which went sort of they're testing it now. It's going to be open for other developers to use. It's basically an interactive way of spectators can sort of support teams. So who's going to win? You can reward the spectators in various ways. Obviously, they have their own token now, the WC token, but other ways in which they can reward people. A whole bunch of sort of stuff they can do, and it feeds into some of the other sort of more sports-like elements to what's going on with Wildcard. So there's very few teams who would have the sort of capacity to do what they're doing, or the funding. I mean, because of his background, he can, he Paul multiple times has raised, $50 million. He's done that a couple of times. There's just not many people in gaming who can do that. So it is sort of super ambitious, but in some ways, it is the logical way to do it. You make a game which is just a game, a Web2 game. You make that the best game you can possibly make, and then you have a Web3 sort of economy ecosystem around that. And then the thing they really want to do, got to again?
Like a framework, then.
Yes, yeah. And the thing they really want to do is almost just use it as a UA attribution tool. So if I do a stream, someone comes in, downloads, wildcards, it has in-app purchases. So if they spend some money in there, then I as the streamer who brought that person in get attributed, I don't know, making it up 5% of that revenue back in. And there's sort of ways you can do that with sort of referral codes and stuff. But obviously on a blockchain, everyone's got a wallet and everything can be tracked. So that's, I think that's exactly what they think is sort of the flywheel there. That streamers can be automatically paid. So they may not just stream Wildcard, obviously maybe streaming whatever other games, League of Legends or whatever. But if you give them a financial incentive that they're getting paid more for doing this, then they're going to do more of that, and you don't have to do these things where, in the moment, when Off the Grid went live, they spent millions of dollars, getting these big streamers in. But that was like, oh, we'll pay these big streamers up front to do 2 streams, and then we're done. I mean, that sort of does work, but the whole point of a lot of this stuff is if you get 1 million little streamers, and you're suddenly they're getting like $50 a month for doing this, then they're just going to do more of it, and then some of those become big streamers, and so you've sort of kickstarted from the ground up an ecosystem that really loves you because you've given them something, and it's not just top down for these big streamers. And the big streamer stuff tends not to be very sustainable. Ninja's not playing Off the Grid anymore because he's not being paid. He's been paid $1 million to do something else now. So that's whoopie-doo for him. But that's one of the bigger problems in games at the moment is advertising and UA. It's just become very expensive, and there's not really been networks where people can build from the bottom up. You can do it on YouTube, but it's really time consuming. You basically have to email people in foreign languages and sort of pay them a bit up front and hope they do the video you want. And it's just very, very manual. Whereas this sort of platform, as Paul says, he's not a crypto bro at all. I don't think he really likes crypto, to be totally honest. I wouldn't imagine he holds tons of crypto in his sort of pension plan or whatever. But he's just like, it's a database system. This is what blockchain's really good at. I'm really happy we could add blockchain into it, but I'm doing it because I think it's going to make our game successful, not to get the Web3 people in there or not to make our investors happy. It's just a really functional bit of technology. And I think, there are the ways you can use blockchain, but I think fundamentally that's sort of where the core use case is going to be.
Well, I think they can sort of rely on that because they know they've got a smashing game to sort of back it up. So if they get esports team in, like they did that collaboration with Team Liquid a while back, if they get those coming in streaming and so on, then it sort of it can grow organically from that because the game is so good. You can't really do that with like a half good Web3 game without streamers, and that's probably why you would choose to go down that route.
And I think, we did talk a bit about esports, and they were conservative on that, and they said all the things you expect people to say, which I've asked many people in the past about, nothing with blockchain games is, and everyone says you can't make an esport, it has to become an esport. The community sort of has to start creating events. But equally, with a platform like Thousands around it, it's much easier for that to happen. And as you say, they've already done some stuff with Team Liquid, who are like one of the, the best known, probably one of the most successful just esports teams out there. And suddenly, esports teams have always struggled with crypto, but also struggled with how, they generate money basically from selling T-shirts and stuff. I mean, it's sort of, this model obviously works, but you can now see, you can imagine sort of Team Liquid has their own streamers. Team Liquid, or people who are streaming Team Liquid stuff suddenly are part of this ecosystem. And suddenly you can imagine these esports teams are generating money through Thousands as a platform. So for the first time, they're sort of part of the ecosystem, whereas previously esports teams don't really scale very well because you do well if if you're number one in the big tournament and win $20 million, that's great. But if you're even in second place, you spent all this money having these teams and training them and blah blah blah. It's just not really worked as a business model for all the teams, which is why they tend to raise a lot of money and then go bust. So this could, obviously we always want to tend to overplay the significance of everything, but I think what they're doing here, and because the game I think is so strong, assuming it is strong, and assuming people on Steam don't not play it because it has a blockchain streaming platform around it, which could happen. But you could see dominoes are sort of aligned in a way where it could sort of do really well.
Yeah, I mean, it already had a strong game, and now it's also got a strong streaming platform built around it. So that's just sort of really enhanced the ecosystem. And I just love that about game developers, maybe particularly Web3 game developers. They sort of realize there's something we need, but we can't find it somewhere, so we're just going to have to build it ourselves. It's just great. Right, anyway, let's finish on that note, and we'll see you all next Friday. Have a good week. Bye-bye.